Hello and a warm welcome from The Curious Case. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Tell me, where are you listening from? Are the skies clear, or is it raining softly where you are? Wherever you are, I hope there's a cup of something warm beside you and a little peace in the air. If you enjoy quiet mysteries and gentle suspense, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's begin. The fire crackled softly. The air smelled of pine and applewood. Candlelight trembled along polished brass, and faint carols drifted from the village green. Lady Bantry stood near the great oak door, hands on her hips, watching the servants with quiet satisfaction. Her hall looked perfect. Holly garlands looped across the walls. Silver bowls gleamed. Every ribbon sat straight, except one thing, the wreath. Miss Marple arrived a little late, shaking snow from her scarf. "You've outdone yourself again, Dolly," she said, eyes moving with that calm precision that saw everything. "Do you think so?" Lady Bantry smiled. "Mrs. Trigger's made it grand this year. Even positioned the red bow at 4 o'clock exactly as I wanted." Dr. Haydock stepped in next, his boots wet with frost. "Fine smell of wood smoke," he said. "Reminds me of peace before the war." Lady Bantry laughed lightly. "Peace is all very well, Doctor, but it won't carve the pudding." The Reverend Clement followed with Griselda at his side, her laughter bright in the old hall. She admired the garlands, then lowered her voice. "I heard the new secretary is quite the beauty. London, trained." "On a penny," said Lady Bantry, almost whispering. "Efficient. Silent. Knows exactly when to appear and vanish." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once. "That sort," she murmured, "is always the one to watch." The guests mingled near the fire, voices soft, glasses clinking. Snow began to fall harder against the windows. Mr. Loftus, the shipping magnate, arrived last, his coat dusted white, his face set with business thoughts even on Christmas Eve. Behind him came his nephew Julian, light-footed, careless, humming a tune that didn't fit the mood. Lady Bantry glanced toward the door again. The wreath glowed faintly in the candlelight, the red satin catching every flicker of flame. She smiled, satisfied, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered longer than the others. Something about it too perfect, perhaps. The bow hung at the right angle, but the base seemed heavier on one side. "Curious," she whispered. "What's that, Jane?" Dolly asked. "Nothing, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Only sometimes a thing too neatly placed has already been moved once." A bell rang from the kitchen. The sound echoed through the hall like a soft warning. Guests turned, unaware that one small detail, the shift of a ribbon, the weight of a wreath, would soon turn comfort into confusion. And somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime. 9 notes, slow, deliberate, each one marking the last calm moment Gossington Hall would know. The drawing-room glowed with firelight. The guests were gathered in easy clusters, voices weaving through the air like the hum of bees. China cups clinked. The scent of cinnamon hung faintly above the punch. Lady Bantry fluttered near the hearth. "A proper village Christmas again," she said. "No rationing, no gloom, just gossip." Dr. Haydock smiled. "You'd rather have scandal than peace, Dolly." She winked. "Scandal keeps the blood warm." Mr. Loftus stood near the mantel, hands behind his back. "Peace rarely lasts when property is involved," he said. Griselda raised an eyebrow. "You mean inheritance?" "Or control," Loftus replied. "They're the same thing in the end." A silence flickered briefly, then laughter covered it. Miss Marple, half hidden behind her knitting, listened without comment. Her eyes drifted from one face to another. The secretary, on a penny, avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Her hands were still, folded too tightly. "Tell me, Miss Penny," said Lady Bantry suddenly, "do you enjoy the season? Or are you one of those practical souls who finds Christmas inefficient?" Honor smiled thinly. "Efficiency doesn't rest, Lady Bantry, not even for carols." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "A dangerous woman, one who organizes her holidays." The room laughed again, but Miss Marple saw the faintest flush of resentment rise on the younger woman's cheek. Julian Loftus entered carrying the tray of punch. "Careful now," he said, almost mockingly. A single drop on the rug, and Aunt Dolly will have us all in confession." "Better confession than scandal," murmured Griselda. Miss Marple looked up. "Scandal," she said gently, "often begins with something quite small. A door left unlocked, a key misplaced." Julian smirked. "Or a wreath hung too straight." The others laughed. But Miss Marple didn't. Outside, the wind rose. The candles flickered. Lady Bantry turned toward the hall. "I never liked locked doors at Christmas," she said lightly. "It feels unlucky." "Superstition," said Loftus, almost sharp. "Locks keep order." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air. Her gaze shifted toward the door, where the great wreath swayed faintly in the draught. The talk returned to carols and puddings, but something in the rhythm of the evening had changed. Too many smiles. Too many guarded glances. One sentence, tossed like a spark, "Locked doors at Christmas," had left its trace. And Miss Marple, in her quiet corner, began to wonder which of them feared an open door most, and why. A faint hum filled the hall, then silence. It lasted just long enough for everyone to notice. Then came a sound no one mistook. A single, sharp crash. Lady Bantry froze. What on earth was that? Julian set down his glass. It came from the library. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the corridor. "And the door's been locked all evening," she said quietly. The group hesitated only a heartbeat before moving. Dolly led the way, skirts brushing the steps, her nerves hidden behind command. At the end of the corridor, the library door stood closed. The holly above it had fallen to the floor. The key gleamed in the lock on the inside. Dr. Haydock tried the handle. It wouldn't move. "Locked from within," he said. Julian's voice cracked. "Uncle?" He knocked once, twice. Nothing. "Fetch the footman," said Lady Bantry quickly. But before anyone could move, Miss Marple reached forward, testing the handle once more. Her fingers lingered. "Strange," she murmured. "It's cold." Dr. Haydock frowned. "Meaning?" "It hasn't been touched in some time," she said softly. They found a small key ring on the hall table, the spare. Julian snatched it, but his hand shook too much to fit the key. Dr. Haydock took over, turning it with steady pressure. The lock clicked. The door swung inward. The air inside was wrong. Still, heavy. The fire burned low, almost out. And on the rug beside the desk lay Mr. Loftus still, pale, his eyes open. No one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked once, then stopped mid-swing. Dr. Haydock bent quickly, checking for a pulse. Then he looked up. "It's over," he said quietly. Lady Bantry whispered, "But the door, how?" Miss Marple stepped closer, eyes tracing the room. Her gaze fixed on the wreath hanging just inside, its green ribbon twisted oddly near the base. She touched it lightly, fingers finding something that shouldn't have been there. A thread of green tape, sticky, fresh. She looked back toward the hall, her voice calm but cold. "Someone thought ahead," she said. "Someone wanted this door locked, after they'd already left." The wind outside rose again, shaking the windows. No one moved. The fire hissed softly. Miss Marple straightened, eyes distant. "Locks," she whispered, "tell their own stories." She turned toward the wreath again, and for the first time that evening, her expression changed from curiosity to certainty. Dr. Haydock rose slowly from beside the body. "No struggle," he said. "No sign of force. He's been struck once, cleanly. Death was instant." Julian stared, color drained. But how could anyone? The door was locked. We all saw it. Lady Bantry pressed a hand to her chest. "And the windows?" "Closed," said Dr. Haydock. "Bolted tight." He moved across the rug, testing the latch. Nothing yielded. Inspector Slack arrived minutes later, coat half-buttoned, eyes already scanning. "Locked room, eh?" he muttered. "They always are when the wrong person dies." He leaned down, examining the hearth. "No weapon?" "None," said Haydock. "Then the killer took it with them, which means—" "He couldn't," said Lady Bantry firmly. The door was locked. From the inside. Miss Marple stood near the bookcase, her hands folded neatly around her gloves. She said nothing. Her gaze drifted over small things, the overturned chair, the scattered papers, the faint smudge on the desk edge. Her eyes lingered on the door frame. The green tape. Slack followed her gaze. Florist tape, isn't it? Lady Bantry blinked. From the wreath. Yes, said Slack. Our decorative centerpiece may have done more than welcome guests. Julian frowned. You think someone used the wreath? No one uses wreaths for murder, said Dolly sharply. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Only clever ones, my dear. Slack scowled. Explain that. But she didn't. She merely stepped to the table and touched a glass half full, unbroken, then the ink blotter. Clean, the safe, still closed. Every detail spoke of control, not panic. Julian moved toward the safe. He kept business papers there. The new codicil, maybe. Slack looked up. What codicil? Something about his will, said Julian. He mentioned it earlier. Lady Bantry gasped. He said he might change the beneficiaries. Slack's jaw tightened. And who loses most from that? No one answered. Miss Marple reached the wreath. The ribbon hung slightly askew now, revealing a narrow seam where none should be. Her fingertips pressed the edge. It gave way just enough to show what looked like a tiny pocket within the moss. She withdrew her hand. No need to disturb it further, she said softly. Slack stared. You think the key was hidden there? She didn't reply. Outside, the clock in the hall struck 10. The echo lingered through the corridor like a question no one wished to ask. Miss Marple turned toward the door once more. Her voice, almost to herself. If the door was locked from within, then someone wanted us to believe he died alone. The next morning, Inspector Slack stood by the library door, notebook in hand. Light poured through the tall windows now, showing every mark the night had hidden. He crouched, running a finger along the sill. No prints, no scratches. Whoever did this had steady hands. Miss Marple joined him quietly. And tidy habits, she said. The kind that sweep away dust rather than leave it. Slack frowned. Dust? She pointed to a faint patch beside the skirting board. Except there. The surface was bare, a clean oval where something had once rested. Dr. Haydock entered, carrying a tray of tea. You two are still at it, he said. You'll wear the rug thin. Slack ignored him. So something was moved. Or replaced, said Miss Marple. Objects can move without being carried away. Lady Bantry appeared in the doorway, pale but composed. Are you saying my decorations are suspicious now? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not suspicious, merely talkative. Slack tapped his pen. The wreath again? Yes, she said simply. It hung here after the body was found, but before then, it was moved. He blinked. Moved? When? She walked closer to the table and brushed her gloved finger along its edge. A smear of green came away. Florist's tape, she said. Same as the wreath. And it's fresh, still tacky. Slack leaned in, examining it under the light. Could have brushed off when we carried him out. Or when it was hung again, Miss Marple murmured. Lady Bantry looked startled. You mean someone rehung it after? Marple nodded. Very likely, to make the door seem undisturbed. Slack straightened. So, someone kills Loftus, locks the door, leaves, and then hangs the wreath to hide the mechanism. Precisely, said Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock frowned. Then where's the missing key? Marple turned to him, eyes thoughtful. A clever person might not hide it far, just cleverly enough. She knelt beside the threshold and traced the grain of the wood. Tiny flecks of green were caught in the groove. Slack crouched beside her. Moss? Yes, moss from the wreath, but not from last night's frost. This was pressed flattened. Meaning? Miss Marple rose. Meaning someone pressed the wreath hard against the door before it was hung, hard enough to leave its memory behind. Slack closed his notebook slowly. A wreath, used like a glove. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Or a mask. She turned toward the window, eyes following the faint line of footprints vanishing across the garden path. They always leave a trace, she said softly, even when they believe they've brushed it all away. Inspector Slack leaned against the mantel, reading from his notes. "At 9 o'clock," he said. The carols began. Everyone accounted for Lady Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Reverend Clement, Miss Penny at the hall table, Julian serving punch. He looked up. That leaves no one unobserved. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Everyone was seen, she said, but not all at the same time. Slack frowned. Meaning memory is kind, she replied. We remember warmth and laughter, not who stood where. Dr. Haydock tapped his cup. The secretary swore she never left the hall. Quite, said Miss Marple. And yet Mrs. Fost said she found the hall table empty around 9. Slack turned. I noted that. She fetched punch cups. Indeed, said Marple softly. And the hall clock struck then. Mrs. Fost remembered because she dislikes being late. Julian stepped forward, restless. You're saying Miss Penny slipped away? I'm saying, Marple replied, that absence can hide behind music. Lady Bantry blinked. You mean she left during the singing? Yes, when everyone's attention was elsewhere. Slack began to pace. So, she could have gone to the library, done the job, and returned before anyone noticed. Exactly. A clever touch. A call timed to prove her presence. Julian frowned. You think she staged it? A performance, said Miss Marple, for the sake of memory. Slack closed his notebook. Then who made the call? Marple looked thoughtful. Someone outside, or perhaps no one at all. The inspector blinked. No one? She smiled faintly. A call can ring unanswered, Inspector. But it can also be planned. A friend waiting by a public booth. A signal of timing. Lady Bantry sighed. But why such precision? To prove innocence before guilt is suspected, said Marple. Haydock shook his head. Still seems thin. Thin things, she murmured, are often threads that bind the whole. Slack stepped to the door. I'll check with the exchange. He paused, looking back. If the call was fake, she lied. Miss Marple's eyes lifted, calm and certain. Not just her. Inspector. He blinked. What's that supposed to mean? She folded her knitting, smoothing the yarn between her fingers. When one lie stands alone, it falls quickly, she said. But when two stand together, her gaze turned toward the window, where faint footprints crossed the snow. Someone else was helping her keep it upright. She looked back to Slack, voice low, steady. Someone lied. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows. The library felt smaller now, quieter, as if the walls themselves were listening. Lady Bantry poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. Miss Marple noticed. Julian stood near the desk, staring at the cold hearth. He spoke without turning. She didn't love him, you know. Not really. She only stayed for what she could gain. Doctor, Haydock sighed. That's cruel, Julian. Is it? He said flatly. He held her future in his pocket. The clock ticked once, then again. Slow, uneven. Slack flipped his notebook open. You were the last to see your uncle alive. Julian looked up, startled. At 8:50, he told me to leave him. Said he had a letter to finish. And you obeyed? Of course. Miss Marple's voice was soft. Obedience, my dear boy, is not your usual habit. Lady Bantry set her cup down. Jane, really. But Marple's eyes stayed on Julian. You said you left the library at 8:50. The footman saw you outside on the terrace 5 minutes later. Julian hesitated. I stepped out for air. In the snow? She asked gently. Without a coat? He flushed. I'd left it inside. Slack smiled faintly. Careless. Not careless, said Marple, hurried. The rain tapped harder against the glass. She turned to Lady Bantry. Did you notice the punch bowl? Later. Half empty, Dolly said. Everyone helped themselves. Everyone? Dolly paused. Well, perhaps not on a penny. She vanished before dessert. Julian's hand tightened on the chair. She said she wasn't hungry. Marple nodded. No one is after fear. Slack stepped forward. Then she left the hall before 9? Yes, said Miss Marple. And you, Mr. Julian, went out after her. He stared. That's absurd. Not absurd. she replied. Human. Her gaze drifted to the wreath again. The bow had shifted slightly in the draught. She watched it sway, the red satin curling inward as though recoiling from something unseen. Silence settled again, heavy and slow. Julian broke it first. You're imagining things, Miss Marple. Perhaps, she said quietly, but imagination, when tied to logic, becomes memory. The clock struck once more. The sound echoed through the hall. Miss Marple's voice was barely a whisper. I see now why the bow moved. Inspector Slack stood at the center of the library, coat off, sleeves rolled up, a man convinced he'd solved the riddle. All right, he said briskly. Let's line it up properly. He glanced around at the faces waiting, then tapped his notebook with a pencil. The time of death between 8:40 and 9. Loftus was struck once. Clean blow, no struggle. The door was locked from the inside. The key was found on the floor, a foot from the body. No weapon. No signs of entry. He looked pleased with himself. A perfect suicide made to look like murder, or a murder meant to look like a suicide. Take your pick. Lady Bantry gasped softly. You can't think he? Couldn't face exposure, said Slack firmly. He was changing his will, remember. People under pressure make odd choices. Dr. Haydock folded his arms. Then who placed the wreath? Someone tidying after, said Slack. Trying to keep up appearances. Simple enough. Miss Marple sat in her chair, quiet, knitting slow and steady. Slack went on, pacing. The secretary's alibi sound. She was seen, heard answering the telephone. The nephew was on the terrace, witnessed by the footman. Lady Bantry was in the drawing room with half the parish. The rest had no access to the keys. Therefore, he concluded, the only person who could have managed it was the victim himself. He turned to Marple. Admit it. It fits clean. She looked up mildly. Clean things, Inspector, are often scrubbed too soon. Slack frowned. Meaning? She smiled faintly. You've placed everyone in the right positions but at the wrong moments. He frowned deeper. Same difference. Not quite, she said. Because people don't lie only about where they were. They lie about when they were there. The clock ticked in the corner, marking her words. Slack shifted, uneasy now. You think my timeline's off? Miss Marple nodded once, her needles flashing. Completely. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. Then who did it, Jane? Marple's gaze lifted toward the wreath again. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. The one person who made sure no one could touch the door. After she did. Slack turned sharply. You mean? Marple didn't answer. She reached into her basket, folded her knitting, and laid it neatly on her lap. Your theory, she said softly, is tidy, Inspector. Too tidy. Her eyes fixed on the faint green stain on the desk edge. One must always ask, she murmured, who benefits when logic appears too perfect? Miss Marple waited until the murmurs settled. Then she rose, smoothing her skirt with both hands. Let's begin again, she said gently. Not with guesses, but with time. Slack sighed, but nodded. Go on, then. The last sighting of Mr. Loftus alive, Marple began, was 8:50. His nephew leaves. To the room. The footman sees him on the terrace moments later. At 9, the carols begin. At 9:05, the telephone rings, and Miss Penny answers it at the hall table. She paused, eyes bright. Now what is wrong with that order? Julian frowned. Nothing, it's what happened. Precisely, she said. It's what everyone remembers, because that was the memory arranged for them. Lady Bantry frowned. Arranged? Yes. The call was planned. Not to summon attention, but to anchor it. Slack tapped his pencil impatiently. You're saying the call was a signal? Marple nodded. Miss Penny needed to ensure that when the body was discovered, everyone recalled her in sight. That's why the call came after the deed, not before. She left earlier around 8:55, went to the library, committed the act, locked the door, and departed by the side path. Then, a confederate phoned precisely at 9:05 so she could be seen answering. Lady Bantry pressed a hand to her mouth. But how could she lock the door from inside? Marple moved closer to the door, eyes on the wreath. With help from this, her gloved hand traced the satin bow. It shifted slightly under her touch, revealing the thin wire loop bound beneath it. You see, the key was attached here, by green florist's tape. Once she pulled the wreath back into place, the key turned from outside, leaving the illusion of a locked room. Slack crouched, incredulous. So she threaded the key through the hole. Not through, said Marple. Against. The wreath was heavy enough to rest tight to the lock. The tape, strong, slightly elastic, let her turn it from the other side. Once it clicked, she detached the tape and rehung the wreath. That's why it looked slightly moved. Dr. Haydock exhaled. Ingenious and cold. Not cold, said Marple softly. Calculated. She feared dismissal, poverty, humiliation, all emotions that burn very warm indeed. Slack flipped back a page. And the missing fibre on the key? Marple smiled faintly. Green silk from the bow, the last thing she touched before wiping it clean. She turned toward him. So now you see, Inspector, the door wasn't locked to protect a dying man. It was locked to protect her story. Silence fell. The clock struck once, as if confirming her words. Marple's gaze returned to the wreath, its festive ribbon limp under the morning light. Her tone softened. Every pattern, however clever, has one stitch reversed. This was hers. Slack muttered. Then it's murder, plain and simple. Marple met his eyes. No, she said quietly. It was planned murder. And that, Inspector? She looked back to the wreath, voice calm, final. Means this was no accident. Inspector Slack stood back while Miss Marple adjusted the chair near the library door. Now, she said calmly, we shall see precisely how it was done. Her tone was patient, almost like a schoolteacher guiding a distracted class. She picked up the spare key from the table and looped a thin thread of florist's tape through its handle. Miss Penny duplicated the library key weeks earlier, Marple began. She needed the original to make an impression, so she removed it once, under pretext of locking the library, took a wax mold, and returned it before anyone noticed. The duplicate stayed hidden here. She lifted the wreath, pointing to the hollow pocket at its base, neatly wrapped in moss, invisible, ready for Christmas Eve. Slack nodded slowly. So she had a spare, but the trick's in the locking. Indeed, Marple replied. Watch closely. She pushed the door nearly shut, leaving the lock visible. Then she pressed the key into the hole, holding the ribbon taut from the outside. When she closed the door after the act, she explained, she looped the tape through the bow, wound once, and pulled gently. The lock turned with a faint metallic click. There, she said, locked from inside by someone standing outside. Dr. Haydock leaned in. That's devilish. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Clever, not devilish. She merely inverted logic. Everyone assumed a lock that turned inward must be turned by a hand within. Few imagine it can be guided from without. Slack frowned. But the wreath, no one saw her carrying it. She didn't need to, said Marple. It hung on the door already. She brought a second one, identical, prepared in advance. The first was replaced after the murder, to hide the mechanism. Lady Bantry looked shaken. 2 wreaths? Yes. One for celebration, one for concealment. Marple stepped back, gesturing toward the telephone on the desk. And now the call. She lifted the receiver, held it briefly, then set it down. The exchange log will show the call came from the public box at Market Basing. The line was used at 9:05, but Miss Penny had arranged it herself. A letter, sent the week before, asked a friend to call at that exact time. She needed witnesses to see her answer. Slack rubbed his forehead. So, when she picked up the receiver, she was confirming her own alibi, said Marple softly. The performance was complete. Dr. Haydock glanced at the window. A perfect illusion. Locked room, tidy scene, grieving secretary. Marple folded the ribbon neatly in her hand. Perfection, she said, is the first flaw detectives should suspect. She turned back toward the phone, eyes calm, almost regretful. The call, she added quietly, was never from a friend. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The call was from herself. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. "All right," he said. "We've got tape, a wreath, and a duplicated key. But theory alone doesn't hang a case, Miss Marple. Give me solid ground." Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Ground," she said, "is exactly what she overlooked." Slack frowned. "Meaning?" "The footprints," Marple answered. "In the garden path. 2 sets leading from the side door, one going out, one coming in. Yet the second pair stop short of the terrace. They end beneath the window, not the door." Slack leaned closer. "So she re-entered through the terrace path?" "No," said Marple. "She never left at all. She only stepped out to create the marks so you'd believe she'd come from outside later, when in truth she'd already returned." He scratched his chin. "That's a neat trick." "It was meant to be," she said. Lady Bantry, pale but steady, spoke from her chair. "Then what about the call, Jane? Couldn't anyone have placed it?" Marple shook her head. "No one else knew the timing. Only Miss Penny. She wrote to the friend who dialed her number, pretending it was for an urgent dictation to impress her employer. Loftus, of course, never heard a word of it. By the time that call came, he was already gone." Slack began pacing. "So, motive security. She feared the will would leave her with nothing." "Yes," said Marple, "and rage is strongest when dressed as reason." Dr. Haydock sighed. "Then every clue circles back to her." "Everyone," Marple said. "The green tape, the key's imprint, the tidy desk, the missing ink smudge. All are marks of her method." Slack stopped. "And the alibi?" "Self-created," said Marple. "Like a spider's web spun too perfectly." He nodded slowly. "She'd have needed nerve." "She had it," Marple said gently. Control was her comfort. The inspector folded his arms. "You're certain?" Marple looked toward the wreath, now resting limp on the table. "Certain," she said, because the one thing she couldn't predict was human reaction. Fear loosens what planning tightens. Slack raised an eyebrow. "And that means—" "When I spoke with her this morning," Marple replied, "her gloves were spotless, but her thumb just the left was stained with green dye. Fresh. Florist's tape leaves its mark longer than gilt does." Lady Bantry whispered, "So it was Honor Penny." "Yes," said Marple quietly. "She tried to hide reason beneath ritual. Christmas, loyalty, duty, all masks for control." Slack straightened. "Then it's settled. We'll bring her in." Marple nodded once, eyes calm. "She will deny it, of course. At first." The inspector turned toward the door. "Then what will make her speak?" Marple gathered her knitting, her voice soft but sure. "The same thing that gives every truth away," she said. "Something small." Something moved. Her gaze shifted to the wreath. The red bow sagged slightly, no longer tight. "That," she murmured, "will be enough." Honor Penny sat straight in the high-backed chair, hands clasped in her lap. The morning light fell across her face, revealing calm eyes that didn't quite match the tremor in her fingers. Inspector Slack stood near the mantel, notebook ready but unused. Miss Marple sat opposite, her knitting silent for once. "Miss Penny," Slack began, "you understand why we've called you. I understand there's been a tragedy," she said evenly, "but I fail to see why my name keeps returning to your lips." "It returns," Miss Marple said gently, "because every thread of reason leads there." Honor's chin lifted. "Reason, yes. But reason is not proof." Slack stepped closer. "We found florist's tape in the door groove. Green tape, the same kind you used for the wreath." Honor smiled faintly. "Half the village used the same kind. The Women's Institute ordered a box of it. Are you planning to arrest them all?" Marple's tone stayed kind. "No, only the one whose thumb bears the stain." For the first time, Honor looked away. "You're mistaken," she said softly. "The telephone call," Slack continued, "arranged from Market Basing at 9:05. You asked a friend to place it." Honor shook her head. "I received a call. I didn't send one." Marple's eyes were steady. "You wrote a letter to Miss Tripp. The postmistress remembers it. Stamped with red sealing wax, your habit." Honor's lips pressed thin. "That proves nothing." I write often. Silence stretched. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Marple leaned forward, voice low. You loved order, schedules, rules. You believed control could make life safe. But people, my dear, are never so tidy. Honor's breath caught, a small sound, like a thread snapping. Mr. Loftus offered me security, she said. Then he took it away. He wanted me dismissed, forgotten. I had nothing left. Slack's tone hardened. So you planned this? I planned to survive, she said quickly. He cornered me. Marple's eyes softened. And so you cornered him. Honor flinched. No, I only meant to frighten him. To stop the change. It wasn't supposed to. She stopped herself. The inspector glanced at Marple. You hear that? But Marple didn't move. Her gaze stayed on Honor, gentle as always. Intent is a word that changes after the fact, she said. You intended safety, but fear turned cleverness into cruelty. Honor's voice broke. He would have ruined me. Marple nodded. And now you've ruined yourself. The clock chimed once. Outside, the rain had stopped. Honor pressed a hand to her face, as though silence itself had accused her. Slack took a step forward, hand reaching for his warrant card. Miss Marple stopped him with a small motion. Not yet, Inspector, she said quietly. She hasn't heard it all. Her voice lowered to a whisper. Not until she knows how we found the missing key. Honor Penny sat straight in the high-backed chair, hands clasped in her lap. The morning light fell across her face, revealing calm eyes that didn't quite match the tremor in her fingers. Inspector Slack stood near the mantel, notebook ready but unused. Miss Marple sat opposite, her knitting silent for once. Miss Penny, Slack began, you understand why we've called you. I understand there's been a tragedy, she said evenly, but I fail to see why my name keeps returning to your lips. It returns, Miss Marple said gently, because every thread of reason leads there. Honor's chin lifted. Reason, yes, but reason is not proof. Slack stepped closer. We found florist's tape in the door groove. Green tape, the same kind you used for the wreath. Honor smiled faintly. Half the village used the same kind. The Women's Institute ordered a box of it. Are you planning to arrest them all? Marple's tone stayed kind. No, only the one whose thumb bears the stain. For the first time, Honor looked away. You're mistaken, she said softly. The telephone call, Slack continued, arranged from Market Basing at 9:05. You asked a friend to place it. Honor shook her head. I received a call. I didn't send one. Marple's eyes were steady. You wrote a letter to Miss Tripp. The postmistress remembers it. Stamped with red sealing wax, your habit. Honor's lips pressed thin. That proves nothing. I write often. Silence stretched. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Marple leaned forward, voice low. You loved order, schedules, rules. You believed control could make life safe. But people, my dear, are never so tidy. Honor's breath caught, a small sound, like a thread snapping. Mr. Loftus offered me security, she said. Then he took it away. He wanted me dismissed, forgotten. I had nothing left. Slack's tone hardened. So you planned this. I planned to survive, she said quickly. He cornered me. Marple's eyes softened. And so, you cornered him. Honor flinched. No, I only meant to frighten him. To stop the change. It wasn't supposed to. She stopped herself. The inspector glanced at Marple. You hear that? But Marple didn't move. Her gaze stayed on Honor, gentle as always. Intent is a word that changes after the fact, she said. You intended safety, but fear turned cleverness into cruelty. Honor's voice broke. He would have ruined me. Marple nodded. And now you've ruined yourself. The clock chimed once. Outside, the rain had stopped. Honor pressed a hand to her face, as though silence itself had accused her. Slack took a step forward, hand reaching for his warrant card. Miss Marple stopped him with a small motion. Not yet, Inspector, she said quietly. She hasn't heard it all. Her voice lowered to a whisper. Not until she knows How we found the missing key. The house was quieter than it had been in days. Rain had stopped, leaving a pale stillness over the garden. Inside, the air carried that strange calm that follows truth, uneasy, but clean. Lady Bantry stood near the hearth, watching the inspector's men move through the hall. "They're always so careful after it's over," she said softly, "as if order can erase what happened." "Doctor," Haydock nodded. "That's how healing begins, tidiness of the mind." Miss Marple folded her knitting into her basket. "Or the illusion of it," she said. "Healing begins only when one stops pretending." Dolly gave a faint smile. "You mean pretending that something like this couldn't happen here?" Marple's eyes warmed. "Exactly that." Julian came in quietly, hat in hand, his face drawn. "She wasn't evil," he said. "Just frightened. It could have been any of us, given enough pressure." Marple looked at him, gently. "Yes, but fear never justifies deceit. It only hides it for a time." He nodded, eyes fixed on the door where the wreath still hung its ribbon limp, its beauty gone. Slack returned from the corridor, his voice low. "She's confessed." Calm as a ledger. Lady Bantry exhaled. "What will become of her?" "The court will decide," he said. "But she won't fight." Dr. Haydock poured tea, steady as ritual. "Perhaps that's mercy truth settling in at last." A log shifted in the grate. The fire flared, then steadied. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, a robin tapped the window, quick and bright against the glass. Lady Bantry smiled sadly. "Strange, isn't it? How life goes on at the exact same pace, no matter what we uncover." Miss Marple looked toward the garden path, where footprints were fading into the thawing snow. "Life forgets quickly," she said. "But patterns those we carry. The cleverness, the vanity, the fear, they always return, just in new forms." Dolly turned to her. "Do you ever tire of seeing it happen again and again?" Marple's reply was soft. "Not tire, my dear. Only wonder when we'll finally learn from it." The clock struck noon. Voices faded down the hall. The great house seemed to breathe again, quiet, slow, alive. Miss Marple reached for her coat. "Best we leave the door unlocked now," she murmured. Dolly nodded. "Yes, enough of locked rooms." They stepped out together into the clearing light, and for one small instant, before the next mystery began, the world felt perfectly still, like a truth finally set free. The afternoon sun slipped across the lace curtains, soft and golden. Miss Marple sat at her small table by the window, a teapot beside her, steam curling gently upward. She moved with unhurried grace, folding her knitting, aligning the cups, restoring the quiet rhythm that always followed disorder. Outside, the village moved on, as it always did, pretending not to notice how close the extraordinary had brushed against it. Lady Bantry had gone home, grateful for calm. Dr. Haydock had left prescriptions and polite advice. Only Miss Marple remained tidying thought as much as space. The cup clinked lightly against its saucer, the sound almost like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. She looked toward the empty chair across from her, where Inspector Slack had sat an hour earlier. His words still lingered. "You make it sound simple, Miss Marple." And she had replied only, "Truth usually is when one stops trying to complicate it." Now, in the hush of her sitting room, that idea settled deeper. She poured another cup, though no one else was there. It was habit, not loneliness, an old courtesy to the unseen. As she stirred, she spoke softly, as if explaining to herself. "Locks and keys," she murmured. "They never really hide anything. They just delay the moment someone dares to look." Her gaze moved to the fire, where one last ember glowed stubbornly. "Poor child," she said quietly. "Too proud to ask for help, too frightened to lose control, and that fear more than greed or envy creates the cleverest crimes." The kettle hissed again, a sigh of reminder that even endings must cool. She reached for her journal and wrote a few words. "Fear builds walls. Truth waits patiently outside." Then she set the pen down, satisfied. Every puzzle, she knew, ended not with proof but with perspective. She lifted her cup. The surface shimmered faintly in the light. "Truth never arrives shouting," she whispered. It waits. It breathes. It slips in quietly like steam rising from a cup. Her eyes softened as she watched it curl, vanish, reform, the way all truths do once they've been freed from silence. A knock sounded faintly at the door, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps no one at all. She didn't rise. The tea was still warm. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that holds both sadness and peace. "Another locked room solved," she said under her breath, "and another heart left open." She took a slow sip, savoring the calm. Outside, a church bell tolled once, echoing through the afternoon air. Miss Marple set her cup down gently, her voice barely a whisper now. "Truth cools slowly," she said, "but it always settles clear." And with that, she returned to her knitting small loops, steady hands, and a heart that never stopped listening. Thank you, dear listener, for joining us tonight in our quiet corner of mysteries. I hope your tea is still warm and your curiosity warmer. What did you notice first? Was it the wreath, the missing key, or perhaps the silence that followed it? Tell us in the comments which clue gave it away for you and if you spotted it before Miss Marple did. If you'd like more stories steeped in calm deduction and quiet truth, don't forget to subscribe, leave a kind word, or join our little circle of members. Every listener, every thought, keeps these tales alive. Until next time, may truth cool slower than tea, and as we close tonight's mystery under a quieter sky, a whisper of the next awaits. Next week, a postman delivers a letter no one wrote. A name appears that should no longer exist. Until then, keep your tea warm, your mind sharper still, and remember, every unopened envelope hides a story waiting to be read.